All right, so let's jump right in. When it comes to the big banks, there's one federal agency that pretty much holds all the cards. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the OCC. They see everything. But the real question is, what part of that whole picture do we, the public, actually get a look at? That's exactly what we're going to unpack.
So think of it like this. On one side, you've got what the regulators see. It's the complete, confidential, inside story of a bank's health, kind of like a locked vault. But on the other side, you have what the public sees, which is more like a curated dashboard, showing very specific pieces of information. And that gap right in the middle, is where the whole story of financial transparency really lives. So here's the game plan for today. We'll start with this idea of two different worlds of information. Then we're going to crack open that public file cabinet to see what's inside, see how it's actually used, and then understand the really delicate balancing act that regulators have to pull off. And finally, we'll get to the powerful story that all this data is telling us.
Okay, first up, a tale of two ledgers. This is really all about that fundamental split between what regulators know from their private behind-the-scenes work and what they decide to share with the rest of the world.
And the bridge that connects those two worlds is something called public disclosures. Simply put, it's just the official release of very specific, non-confidential info. The whole point, really, is to create transparency and keep institutions accountable, but without giving away all the secret ingredients of how they supervise.
So what is actually in this public file cabinet? Let's go ahead and pry it open and see what key documents the OCC makes available for pretty much anyone to go and find.
And the amount of information is actually pretty wide-ranging. You can find basic stuff like bank directories and their charters. You can also look up a bank's Community Reinvestment Act rating, or CRA rating, to see how well it's actually serving its local community. You can even find the formal enforcement actions, the official risk laps, and policy letters that show how the OCC is thinking about the rules.
But, and this is a big but, it's so important to understand this is not a completely open book. Some of the most critical internal metrics, they stay totally confidential. We're talking about things like the super detailed CAMELS ratings, which grade a bank's health on everything from capital and assets to management and liquidity. That stuff, plus the specific back and forth letters between the regulator and the bank, that stays deep inside the vault.
So, with what is public, how does it all come together? This data isn't just collecting digital dust somewhere. Real people are using it, right now, to piece together a much clearer picture of the financial world.
Let's put ourselves in someone else's shoes for a second. Imagine you're a journalist and you're digging into a story about a regional bank. You can't just call up the bank and expect them to tell you everything, right? So where do you start? You start with the public disclosures.
Your process might look a little something like this. First, you'd pull up the bank's CRA ratings. Are they actually helping their community? Then you dig into their enforcement history. Have they been in hot water before? Next, you'd compare all that data with other similar banks to get some real context. And only then, after connecting all those dots, can you actually publish your story.
And it's not just journalists, right? Community groups use this exact same data to see how a bank is impacting their neighborhood. Investors use it to track regulatory pressure, and analysts use it to compare institutions and spot huge industry-wide trends. At the end of the day, this publicly available data is what really fuels accountability.
Now this brings us to a really, really critical question. If transparency is so important, why isn't everything public? This is where we get into the incredibly tricky balancing act that regulators are constantly performing.
See, the OCC is always weighing transparency against these other massive priorities. If they released really sensitive data, it could maybe trigger a panic or a bank run, which would threaten the whole system's stability. It could violate a bank's privacy, and it could totally undermine the honest, candid conversations they need to have with banks to do their job right. It is a very high-stakes tightrope walk.
And that balance? It's not set in stone. It's always changing. After the 2008 financial crisis, the public demand for transparency just went through the roof. Then, the whole fintech explosion created this need for new rules and disclosures for digital banking. And today, the standards for public accountability are still evolving as we speak.
So let's bring this all home. Because when you step back and look past all the individual files and reports, you start to realize that these public disclosures, they're actually telling a much, much bigger story.
There's this quote that just absolutely nails it. Most of the day-to-day work of supervising a bank happens quietly, behind closed doors. But the pieces that are intentionally put out there for the public, that becomes the official narrative. That's the story the entire world gets to read and react to.
And here's the real kicker.
the thing that makes all of this possible. The whole file cabinet idea is a nice metaphor, but the reality is so much more powerful. Behind every single report, every rating, every public notice, it's not just a pile of documents, it's a massive, complex, and highly structured database. This is the technology that turned financial transparency from a vague idea into a workable reality.
I mean, just stop and think about the sheer scale of this for a second. Every single data point, every CRA rating, every single enforcement action, every policy update, it all has to be collected, categorized, and stored in a standardized way so that it's retrievable, so it's shareable. This isn't just clerical work, it's data architecture on a massive scale. The history of public disclosure isn't just about policy changes, it is fundamentally tied to the history of databases themselves and our ever-growing ability to manage incredible amounts of information.
So all of this data is out there, perfectly organized and accessible, all because of these powerful systems. It's just waiting. Waiting for someone like you to connect the dots and tell a new story. So the final question really is, what story are you going to find?